In the most prestigious courthouse of Manhattan, a judge's laughter would turn to silence as a teenage boy was about to expose a truth that would shake the entire legal system. Nobody expected that this young man in his father's old suit would possess a mind that even Harvard's finest would envy. But today, everything was about to change. The marble halls of New York's Supreme Court echoed with purpose on that crisp autumn morning. Sunlight streamed through towering windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors where legal titans in $1,000 suits strode with measured confidence. Courtroom 712 buzzed with anticipation, not for the usual parade of corporate lawyers, but for what the media had dubbed the Goldman Exchange Scandal. The gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder, filled with dark suits and expectant faces, while legal interns scribbled furiously in notepads, hoping to witness another legendary Montgomery cross-examination. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Judge Alexandra Montgomery's reputation preceded her like a storm cloud. Her 25 years on the bench had earned her the nickname the Executioner, not for harsh sentences, but for her ruthless dismantling of unprepared attorneys. Her chambers had reduced seasoned lawyers to stuttering first-years, and today's high-stakes case had drawn every legal journalist in the city. The air crackled with tension as bailiffs moved with military precision, their shoes clicking against the hardwood floors. At the prosecution's table sat James Winston III, the state's star prosecutor, his silver hair and steel-rimmed glasses projecting an aura of invincibility. His team of 6 attorneys surrounded him like a wall of legal expertise, each armed with tablets and leather-bound portfolios. They represented everything the system stood for: power, preparation, and pedigree. The defense table, in stark contrast, sat conspicuously empty. "Mr. Bailiff, what time do we have?" Judge Montgomery's voice cut through the whispers like a blade. The bailiff responded promptly, 9:59, Your Honor." She nodded, her steel-gray hair catching the morning light. "1 minute until I dismiss this case by default. The defense's failure to appear shows a level of disrespect that I—" The heavy oak doors groaned open, interrupting her declaration. Every head in the courtroom turned, expecting to see a team of attorneys rushing in with apologies. Instead, a solitary figure stood in the doorway, haloed by the light from the corridor beyond. Michael Chen, 16 years old, stepped into courtroom 712. His father's navy blazer hung loose on his narrow shoulders, the sleeves slightly too long. He carried a weathered backpack that had seen one too many school years, and under his arm, a stack of dog-eared law books threatened to slip free. The silence lasted 3 heartbeats before laughter rippled through the gallery. Even Winston's team exchanged amused glances, their earlier tension evaporating at the sight of this apparent lost schoolboy. Judge Montgomery leaned forward, her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose, her expression wavering between annoyance and amusement. "Young man, unless you're looking for a civics class, I suggest you find your way back to—" "Michael Chen for the defense, Your Honor." His voice rang clear and steady, cutting through the remaining chuckles. "Representing my father, Dr. James Chen, in the matter of State versus Chen." The laughter died. Judge Montgomery's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Is this some kind of joke?" Michael stepped forward, his posture straight despite the weight of every stare in the room. "No joke, Your Honor. Under State Law Section 478, Paragraph 3, any person may represent themselves or an immediate family member in a court of law, regardless of age or professional qualification." Winston rose slowly from his chair, his voice dripping with condescension. "Your Honor, surely we're not going to entertain this mockery of—" "I am aware of the statute, Mr. Chen," Judge Montgomery interrupted, her tone arctic. "I'm also aware this is a complex criminal case involving international finance, corporate law, and potential federal charges. You expect this court to believe you're qualified to handle such matters?" Michael placed his backpack on the defense table, the sound echoing in the now silent courtroom. When he looked up at the bench, there was something in his eyes that made Judge Montgomery pause, a certainty that seemed far beyond his years. "Your Honor," he said, pulling out a meticulously organized folder, I expect this court to judge me by the merit of my arguments, not by the number of years I've walked this earth. And if you'll allow me to proceed, I believe I can prove that my father's case deserves more than a default dismissal. Judge Montgomery studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. The entire courtroom held its breath, waiting for her legendary temper to explode. Finally, she spoke. Mr. Che, you have 5 minutes to convince me this isn't the biggest mistake of your young life. After that, either you'll be calling your school to explain your absence or... She paused, a slight curl touching her lip. You'll be making history in my courtroom. Michael nodded once, opened his folder, and began to speak. Michael's voice, steady and clear, filled the hushed courtroom. Your Honor, the Goldman Exchange case isn't just about complex financial transactions or corporate misconduct. At its heart, it's about a deliberate attempt to destroy an innocent man's reputation. He pulled out a single sheet of paper, holding it with unwavering hands. The prosecution claims my father orchestrated an elaborate scheme to defraud investors, but they've overlooked one crucial detail. The timeline doesn't match their narrative. The gallery leaned forward collectively as Michael approached the prosecution's table. Winston's smirk remained fixed, but his eyes tracked the teenager's movement with growing curiosity. The state's entire case rests on a series of transactions that allegedly occurred between March 15th and April 30th of last year. During this exact period, my father was in Beijing, giving a series of documented lectures at the International Conference on Medical Innovation. He couldn't have accessed the secure trading terminals required for these transactions. Judge Montgomery's eyebrows lifted slightly as Michael produced a stack of notarized documents. These are my father's travel records, conference schedules, and time-stamped video recordings of his presentations. Each one has been authenticated by both the Chinese and American embassies. He placed them carefully on the evidence table. Furthermore, the prosecution's own evidence shows that the fraudulent trades were executed from an IP address in Lower Manhattan, over 7,000 miles from where my father was standing. Winston's confident demeanor cracked slightly as he leafed through the documents. His junior associates began furiously typing on their tablets, presumably fact-checking Michael's claims. The gallery's whispers grew louder, and Judge Montgomery rapped her gavel once, restoring silence. An interesting start, Mr. Chen, the judge said, studying him over her glasses. But proving your father wasn't physically present doesn't negate the possibility of him orchestrating these events remotely. The prosecution has substantial evidence of communication between Dr. Chen and the trading desk. Michael nodded, as if he'd anticipated this exact challenge. That brings me to my second point, Your Honor. He reached into his backpack and withdrew a laptop, its surface scratched from years of use. With the court's permission, I'd like to demonstrate something about those communications. Judge Montgomery gestured for him to proceed, her initial skepticism now tinged with intrigue. The courtroom watched as Michael connected his laptop to the room's projection system. The screen flickered to life, displaying a series of email exchanges that the prosecution had entered into evidence. These emails appear to show my father giving explicit instructions for the fraudulent trades, Michael began, his fingers moving deftly across the keyboard. But look at the metadata hidden within these messages. He pulled up a complex string of code that made several of Winston's associates sit up straighter. The emails were composed using a text editor that wasn't released until 3 months after my father's arrest. In fact, this specific version wasn't even in beta testing when these messages were supposedly written. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Winston stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Objection, Your Honor. This child is presenting technical evidence without any expert qualification. We have no way to verify these claims. Judge Montgomery turned her piercing gaze to Michael. Mr. Chen, are you prepared to substantiate these technical assertions? Yes, Your Honor. Michael pulled out another folder. I've prepared a detailed analysis comparing the metadata timestamps with the software release schedules, certified by 3 independent digital forensics experts. Additionally, ... he paused, allowing a slight smile to cross his face. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I wrote my thesis on digital forensics and email security protocols last summer during an advanced cybersecurity program at MIT. I can walk the court through every technical detail if needed. The silence that followed was deafening. Winston's face had lost its condescending smile, replaced by a look of growing concern. His team was now huddled in intense discussion, papers flying between them as they reassessed their strategy. Judge Montgomery leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful as she studied the young man standing before her. "Very well, Mr. Chen," she said finally. "You've earned yourself more than 5 minutes, but I warn you, if this is merely a prelude to smoke and mirrors, you'll find my patience has strict limits." Michael's response was interrupted by a commotion at the courtroom doors. A man in an expensive suit burst in, his face flushed with urgency. He hurried to Winston's table, whispering something that made the prosecutor's face pale visibly. The gallery buzzed with speculation as Winston asked for a brief recess, which Judge Montgomery reluctantly granted. As the courtroom emptied for the break, Michael remained at the defense table, calmly organizing his notes. In the gallery, journalists were already furiously typing on their phones, undoubtedly reporting on the unprecedented scene they'd just witnessed. But Michael's mind was elsewhere. This was just the beginning. He had spent months preparing for this moment, and he knew that the real battle was still to come. The truth about the Goldman Exchange Scandal ran far deeper than anyone in the courtroom suspected, and he was about to unravel it all. When court resumed after the recess, the atmosphere had shifted palpably. Winston's team had rearranged themselves, bringing forward a young associate who appeared to be their technical expert. Judge Montgomery surveyed the scene with sharp eyes, noting how the gallery had grown even more crowded during the break. Word of the morning's events had clearly spread through the courthouse. "Mr. Winston," Judge Montgomery's voice carried across the now packed courtroom, "I believe you had something to address before we continue with Mr. Chen's presentation." The prosecutor stood, his earlier condescension replaced by carefully measured professionalism. "Yes, Your Honor. We've taken the opportunity to conduct a preliminary verification of Mr. Chen's claims regarding the email metadata. While we don't concede his conclusions, He paused, choosing his words carefully. "We acknowledge that certain aspects of our digital evidence require additional scrutiny." Michael remained perfectly still at the defense table, but a keen observer might have noticed the slight upturn at the corner of his mouth. He had anticipated this moment. It was why he'd started with the metadata evidence, but it was merely a foundation for what was to come. "However," Winston continued, his voice growing stronger, "this technical anomaly doesn't address the core of our case. We have sworn testimony from 3 senior Goldman Exchange executives, all confirming Dr. Chen's direct involvement in the fraud. These are respected professionals with decades of experience in the industry. Their credibility is beyond reproach." Michael raised his hand slightly, requesting permission to respond. Judge Montgomery nodded, her expression neutral but attentive. "Your Honor, the prosecution's reliance on this testimony actually brings us to the heart of this case." He stood, moving to retrieve another folder from his backpack. "I would like to direct the court's attention to the relationship between these 3 executives and a series of offshore companies registered in the Cayman Islands." Winston's technical expert whispered something urgent in his ear, but Michael continued. "These companies, Meridian Holdings, Blue Apex International, and Cascade Ventures, appear to be independent entities. However," he projected a complex web of financial transactions onto the courtroom screen. "When we follow the money, we discover something fascinating." The courtroom fell silent as Michael began to trace the flow of funds through a labyrinth of transactions. His explanation was methodical, making complex financial concepts accessible without oversimplifying them. Each of these executives received substantial consulting fees from these companies in the months leading up to their testimony. The payments were carefully structured to avoid detection, split into multiple transfers just below the reporting threshold. A senior member of Winston's team stood up sharply. Objection, Your Honor. These allegations against respected witnesses are completely unfounded. Mr. Chen is engaging in wild speculation. Not speculation, Michael interrupted calmly, producing another stack of documents. These are certified bank records obtained through proper channels. Each transaction is documented, verified, and notarized, but more importantly, he pulled up a new document on the screen. This is an email recovered from a backup server in Singapore, sent by Marcus Goldman himself, the CEO of Goldman Exchange. The prosecutor's team erupted in whispered conversations as Michael continued. The email discusses the need to, and I quote, ensure Chen takes the fall for the regulatory oversight issues. The witnesses need to be properly motivated. The timestamp on this email predates the first witness testimony by exactly 2 weeks. Judge Montgomery leaned forward, her interest now fully engaged. Mr. Chen, these are serious allegations. How did you obtain this email? Through entirely legal means, Your Honor, Michael responded, producing yet another document. This is a formal request submitted to the Singapore Data Protection Commission, followed by their official authorization for the data release. Every step was documented and followed proper international protocols for evidence gathering. The gallery buzzed with excitement as Winston and his team huddled in intense discussion. Michael used this moment to arrange his next set of evidence on the defense table. He knew what was coming. They would try to discredit the email's authenticity, but he had already prepared for that challenge. Your Honor, Winston finally spoke, his voice tight with controlled tension. We request a brief adjournment to review this new evidence. The prosecution was not made aware of these documents during discovery. Because they weren't in our possession during the discovery phase, Michael interjected smoothly. The Singapore server data was only released last week. I have the dated documentation here, along with proof of immediate disclosure to the prosecution's office upon receipt. Perhaps your team overlooked the notification. Judge Montgomery's lips twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. Mr. Winston, while I appreciate your position, I'm inclined to let Mr. Chen continue. He appears to have followed proper procedure for evidence disclosure. She turned her gaze to Michael. However, young man, I expect you to demonstrate the relevance of these revelations to your father's defense. The court's patience for dramatic flourishes, however well executed, is not infinite. Michael nodded, reaching for his laptop once again. Of course, Your Honor. In fact, these documents are merely the prelude to the true nature of the Goldman Exchange Scandal. With the court's permission, I'm prepared to demonstrate how my father was not only innocent of these charges, but was actively working to expose a massive financial conspiracy when he was suddenly arrested and silenced. The narrator's voice softens, drawing the audience into Michael's story as the courtroom scene temporarily fades. To understand how a 16-year-old found himself defending his father in one of the most significant financial fraud cases of the decade, we need to go back 6 months. Back to the night that changed everything for the Chen family. The scene shifts to a modest apartment in Queens, where Michael sat at his desk, surrounded by advanced calculus textbooks. The sound of urgent knocking shattered the quiet of his late-night studying. Through the peephole, he saw 2 FBI agents, their badges gleaming under the hallway lights. His mother, Li Wei, a professor of classical literature, opened the door with trembling hands. The news they delivered would tear their world apart. Dr. James Chen, a brilliant quantitative analyst who had spent his career developing algorithms to detect financial fraud, had been arrested. The charges: orchestrating a complex scheme that had allegedly defrauded investors of over $300 million. The evidence seemed overwhelming: emails, trading records, witness testimonies, all pointing to a man who had apparently used his expertise to exploit the very systems he helped protect. But Michael knew his father. Dr. Chen had spent countless evenings at their dinner table, passionately explaining to his son how his algorithms could spot irregular trading patterns and protect small investors from market manipulation. He had taught Michael to code when he was just 8, cultivating in him a deep understanding of both technology and ethics. The idea that his father would commit fraud was more than unlikely. It was impossible. The night of my father's arrest, Michael's voice now echoed through the courtroom, I found something strange on our home computer. a series of encrypted files hidden within a folder of family photos. He projected a screenshot onto the courtroom display. The encryption was complex, using a key based on a theorem my father had taught me years ago. He knew that if anything happened to him, I would be the only one who could unlock these files. The gallery watched in rapt attention as Michael explained how he had spent months piecing together the puzzle his father had left behind. Every night after school, while his classmates played video games or went to parties, he buried himself in legal textbooks, financial regulations, and court precedents. His mother would find him asleep at his desk, face pressed against pages of carefully annotated case law. What I discovered in those encrypted files, Michael continued, his voice growing more intense, was evidence of a massive conspiracy within Goldman Exchange. My father had developed an algorithm that could detect sophisticated forms of market manipulation, but when he presented his findings to the board, showing how certain executives were profiting from illegal trading practices, he was suddenly targeted for investigation himself. Judge Montgomery studied the young man before her, noting how his initial nervousness had been replaced by passionate conviction. Mr. Chen, while this background is compelling, the court needs more than just a son's faith in his father's innocence. Do you have concrete evidence to support these claims? Michael nodded, pulling out a thick binder. Yes, Your Honor. What the prosecution doesn't know is that my father's algorithm continued running even after his arrest. For 6 months it has been collecting data, tracking patterns, and building an irrefutable case. He turned to face Winston and his team. The same trading patterns that my father detected before his arrest have continued, following the exact same sophisticated methodology. The only difference is that the profits are now being channeled through a different set of offshore accounts. The technical expert on Winston's team was frantically whispering in the prosecutor's ear, but Michael pressed on. Furthermore, I've cross-referenced the algorithm's findings with international banking records. The dates and amounts of suspicious trades perfectly align with large deposits made to accounts controlled by 3 members of Goldman Exchange's board of directors, the same board members who authorized the internal investigation that led to my father's arrest. A murmur ran through the gallery as Michael projected a series of graphs and charts onto the screen. Each one showed clear patterns of irregular trading activity, overlaid with banking transactions that couldn't be mere coincidence. The prosecution's team was now in visible disarray, papers shuffling frantically as they tried to keep up with this unexpected turn of events. Your Honor, Michael's voice softened slightly, showing a glimpse of the teenager beneath the legal prodigy. My father isn't just innocent, he's a whistleblower who was silenced because he discovered something too dangerous to ignore. And I can prove it, not with speculation or theory, but with data that would stand up to any expert analysis. Judge Montgomery removed her glasses, fixing Michael with a penetrating stare. Mr. Chen, you realize that if what you're saying is true, this case extends far beyond a simple fraud charge. You're alleging a conspiracy that could shake the entire financial industry. Michael met her gaze steadily. Yes, Your Honor. And that's exactly why I'm here. Because sometimes justice needs a voice that isn't bound by professional obligations or industry connections. Sometimes it needs someone who has nothing to lose and everything to prove. The atmosphere in courtroom 712 had transformed entirely. Gone was the earlier mockery of the teenage defender. In its place, a tense anticipation hung in the air. Winston rose from his chair, adjusting his tie with deliberate slowness. Your Honor, while Mr. Chen's presentation is impressive for someone his age, we have our own technical expert who can easily demonstrate the flaws in his analysis. Judge Montgomery gestured for Winston to proceed. The prosecutor nodded to a woman in his team, Dr. Sarah Martinez, her credentials in quantitative analysis and financial forensics as long as her stern expression. She approached the podium with a tablet in hand, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor with practiced authority. If I may, Your Honor, Dr. Martinez began, her voice carrying the weight of 20 years in financial forensics. I've reviewed the trading patterns Mr. Chen claims are suspicious. While they might appear irregular to an amateur observer, they're actually quite common in high-frequency trading environments. She projected her own series of charts, attempting to counter Michael's evidence. What the defendant's son has identified as suspicious patterns are simply standard market-making activities. Michael watched quietly, his expression unchanged as Dr. Martinez continued her technical dissection. She spoke about algorithmic trading norms, market volatility patterns, and statistical anomalies that could explain away his findings. The gallery's attention swung between her authoritative presentation and Michael's apparent calm in the face of this challenge. Furthermore, Dr. Martinez continued, her confidence growing. The encryption method Mr. Chen claims to have broken would be virtually impossible to crack without significant computing power and advanced knowledge of cryptography. The idea that a teenager could— "Excuse me, Dr. Martinez," Michael interrupted politely, rising from his chair. "Could you please explain the specific encryption standard you're referring to?" The expert paused, slightly thrown by the direct question. "I'm speaking of the standard RSA 4096 encryption that Goldman Exchange uses for all its secure communications." A slight smile played at the corners of Michael's mouth. "That's interesting because the files weren't encrypted with RSA 4096. He walked to the prosecution's table, tablet in hand. "They used a custom encryption algorithm based on the Riemann hypothesis and its applications in quantum cryptography, a paper my father published in the Journal of Advanced Mathematics last year. Would you like me to explain the mathematical principles behind it?" Dr. Martinez blinked, clearly unprepared for this level of technical discussion from a teenager. Michael didn't wait for her response. He turned to the court's display system and began writing out a series of complex mathematical equations. The beauty of this encryption method lies in its use of prime number patterns that most standard cryptographic tools wouldn't even think to look for. You see, by applying the Riemann zeta function to— For the next 10 minutes, Michael delivered what amounted to a graduate-level lecture on advanced cryptography. He moved through complex mathematical concepts with the ease of someone discussing the weather, while Dr. Martinez's expression grew increasingly uncomfortable. Even Judge Montgomery leaned forward, her usual stern expression replaced by genuine interest. "Which is why," Michael concluded, "traditional cryptanalysis tools would have seen these files as corrupted data rather than encrypted information. The decryption key wasn't based on computational power. It was based on understanding the mathematical principle my father used to teach me when I was 12. The gallery sat in stunned silence. Dr. Martinez had taken her seat, her earlier confidence visibly shaken. Winston whispered urgently with his team, their faces showing growing concern. Judge Montgomery cleared her throat. "Mr. Chen, while your knowledge of cryptography is remarkable, the prosecution's broader point about trading patterns still stands. How do you respond to Dr. Martinez's explanation of these being normal market-making activities?" Michael nodded, as if he'd been waiting for this question. "I'm glad you asked, Your Honor, because this is where the prosecution's entire technical argument falls apart." He pulled up a new set of data on the screen. Dr. Martinez is correct that high-frequency trading can create patterns that look irregular to the untrained eye. However, he highlighted specific sequences in the data. These patterns show something far more specific. They demonstrate a technique known as layering, creating multiple orders at different price levels to create the illusion of market depth. He turned to face Dr. Martinez directly. "Would you agree, Doctor, that layering is a form of market manipulation prohibited under Section 9(2) of the Securities Exchange Act?" The expert shifted uncomfortably in her seat as Michael continued. "Because these patterns match exactly with the illegal trading strategy my father's algorithm was designed to detect. The same strategy that mysteriously continued after his arrest, generating profits for accounts controlled by Goldman Exchange board members." Judge Montgomery raised her hand, stopping Winston before he could object. "Mr. Chen, are you prepared to submit your father's original algorithm for independent verification?" Michael's response was immediate. "Not only am I prepared, Your Honor, but I've already arranged for 3 independent forensic computing firms to analyze both the algorithm and its findings. Their sealed reports are ready for the court's review." Judge Montgomery studied the 3 sealed envelopes Michael had just submitted to the court. Each bore the distinctive letterheads of prestigious forensic computing firms, their contents potentially holding the key to unraveling the entire case. She broke the first seal, her eyes scanning the detailed analysis within. The gallery held its collective breath, the silence broken only by the soft rustle of papers. "These reports," she began, looking up at Michael over her reading glasses, "are quite extraordinary. Not only do they confirm your technical analysis, but they've identified additional patterns that suggest an even broader scope of market manipulation." She turned to Winston, who had been conferring urgently with his team. "Mr. Winston, has the prosecution reviewed similar independent analyses?" The prosecutor stood slowly, his earlier confidence notably diminished. "Your Honor, our technical analysis was conducted internally by Goldman Exchange's compliance department." The words had barely left his mouth when he realized his mistake. Michael pounced on the opening. "Internal compliance?" Michael's voice carried a hint of incredulity. "The same compliance department that reports directly to the board members whose accounts received mysterious deposits matching the fraudulent trading profits?" He approached the evidence table, pulling out another document. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit this organizational chart of Goldman Exchange's corporate structure. Notice how the compliance department's reporting line was changed just 2 weeks before my father's algorithm detected the first instance of market manipulation." The projection screen displayed a complex web of corporate hierarchies, with key dates highlighted in red. The previous structure had compliance reporting independently to an external oversight committee. But after this change, Michael traced the new reporting line with his laser pointer. All findings had to be approved by an internal committee led by the very board members my father's algorithm would later flag for suspicious activities. Winston's team scrambled to respond, but Michael wasn't finished. He pulled up a series of internal emails obtained through discovery. These communications show the gradual dismantling of independent oversight within Goldman Exchange. Each change was subtle, buried in bureaucratic language about streamlining processes and improving efficiency. But together, they created the perfect environment for sophisticated market manipulation. Judge Montgomery leaned forward, her interest clearly piqued. "Mr. Chen, while this organizational restructuring is suspicious, it doesn't directly prove your father's innocence. How do you connect these changes to his arrest?" Michael smiled slightly. He had been waiting for this question. "Your Honor, I draw your attention to this timeline." He displayed a new document, meticulously detailed with dates, events, and supporting evidence. My father's algorithm first flagged suspicious trading patterns on March 3rd. On March 5th, he submitted his initial report to the new compliance committee. By March 7th, the committee had dismissed his concerns as unfounded. And on March 8th, he paused for effect. The first of several large deposits was made to offshore accounts controlled by committee members. The gallery erupted in whispers as Michael continued. But here's where it gets interesting. After dismissing my father's report, the committee didn't just ignore his findings. They actively worked to discredit him. These internal messages show a coordinated effort to plant false evidence, manipulate trading records, and pressure key witnesses. He projected a series of chat logs onto the screen. These conversations took place on Goldman Exchange's secure messaging system. The participants thought these logs were automatically deleted after 30 days, but my father's algorithm had been quietly archiving them. They show explicit discussions about handling the Chen problem and ensuring the right narrative reaches the authorities. Winston rose to object, but Michael smoothly preempted him. And before the prosecution questions the authenticity of these logs, I've already submitted them for forensic analysis. The timestamps, digital signatures, and metadata all confirm their authenticity. Furthermore, he reached into his backpack and withdrew a final folder. I have sworn affidavits from 2 junior members of the compliance committee who were present during these discussions. They've agreed to testify about the systematic effort to frame my father. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Montgomery reviewed the new evidence. Even Winston's team had stopped their frantic note-taking, the weight of Michael's revelations sinking in. The teenager stood calmly at the podium, his preparation evident in every detail he had presented. "Your Honor," Michael concluded, his voice carrying a quiet intensity. "What we're seeing here isn't just a case of financial fraud. It's a deliberate conspiracy to silence a whistleblower who threatened to expose a much larger scheme. My father didn't commit these crimes. He was arrested because he tried to prevent them." Judge Montgomery removed her glasses, fixing Michael with a penetrating stare. "Mr. Chen, you've presented a compelling narrative with substantial supporting evidence. However," she paused, her expression hardening slightly, "if what you're alleging is true, then we're looking at a conspiracy that extends far beyond the scope of this case. Are you prepared for the implications of these accusations?" Michael stood straighter, meeting her gaze without hesitation. "Your Honor, I'm not just prepared. I have additional evidence that takes us even deeper into Goldman Exchange's operations. What I've shown so far is just the foundation. With the court's permission, I'd like to demonstrate how this conspiracy extends into the highest levels of financial regulation itself." The tension in courtroom 712 had reached a fever pitch as Michael prepared to reveal his next piece of evidence. The late afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the proceedings. Winston and his team had called for another brief recess, but Judge Montgomery denied their request with a sharp rap of her gavel. "Proceed, Mr. Chen," she commanded, her voice carrying both authority and unmistakable curiosity. "You've alleged connections to financial regulators. The court needs to hear this." The gallery leaned forward collectively, journalists' fingers hovering over their notepads. Michael nodded, pulling up a new series of documents on the display. "Your Honor, what I'm about to present connects Goldman Exchange to a pattern of regulatory capture that spans the last 5 years." He displayed a complex network diagram. "These are the career paths of 6 senior regulators who oversaw Goldman Exchange's compliance reviews. Notice anything unusual about their employment history?" The diagram showed a disturbing pattern. Each regulator had left their government position for high-paying consulting roles at subsidiaries of Goldman Exchange, only to return to regulatory positions with greater authority. The revolving door wasn't just spinning, it was being orchestrated. "But the true significance isn't in their career moves," Michael continued, his voice steady. "It's in the timing." He highlighted specific dates on the timeline. Each regulatory review that could have exposed the market manipulation coincided perfectly with strategic personnel changes. The regulators who might have caught the fraud were systematically replaced by those compromised by their Goldman Exchange connections. Winston shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. These allegations against federal regulators are completely beyond the scope." Judge Montgomery cut him off with a raised hand. "Mr. Winston, given the nature of the evidence Mr. Chen has presented thus far, I'm inclined to let him continue. Though I remind you, Mr. Chen, that extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof." Michael responded by pulling out a thick binder. "These are sworn affidavits from 3 former Goldman Exchange compliance officers who were terminated after raising concerns about these regulatory relationships. They detail specific meetings, dates, and dollar amounts involved in what amounts to a systematic corruption of the regulatory process." He projected excerpts from the affidavits, each more damning than the last. The documents revealed a calculated effort to place cooperative regulators in key positions, ensuring that Goldman Exchange's more questionable activities would escape scrutiny. The gallery buzzed with whispers as journalists furiously took notes. "But here's what makes these affidavits particularly significant," Michael continued, highlighting specific passages. "Each one independently corroborates a crucial detail from my father's original algorithm findings. The trading patterns he identified weren't just technical violations. They were symptoms of a much larger system of market manipulation, protected by compromised regulators." Dr. Martinez, the prosecution's expert, whispered something to Winston, who shook his head sharply. Michael noticed the exchange and smiled slightly. "I suspect Dr. Martinez has just realized what these patterns really indicate. Would you like to share your insight with the court, Doctor?" The expert shifted uncomfortably in her seat before standing. "Your Honor, if what Mr. Chen is suggesting is accurate, The trading patterns wouldn't just be isolated incidents of market manipulation. They would indicate— She paused, choosing her words carefully. A systematic exploitation of regulatory blind spots, coordinated across multiple markets. Exactly, Michael agreed, pulling up a new set of charts. These patterns appear random when viewed individually, but when we apply my father's algorithm across all of Goldman Exchange's trading activities, a clear picture emerges. The manipulation wasn't just about profiting from individual trades. It was about creating artificial market conditions that only those with inside knowledge could exploit. He displayed a series of transaction records, color-coded to show the pattern. Notice how each manipulated trade is followed by a series of perfectly timed transactions from accounts connected to our compromised regulators. They weren't just turning a blind eye to the fraud. They were actively profiting from their advanced knowledge of it. The prosecution team was now in visible disarray. Their earlier confidence completely evaporated. Winston's junior associates were frantically making phone calls, stepping in and out of the courtroom with increasingly worried expressions. Your Honor, Michael said, his voice taking on a note of gravity. What my father discovered wasn't just a financial crime. It was an elaborate system designed to undermine the very foundations of market integrity. And when he threatened to expose it, he paused, letting the implications sink in. Well, that's when a brilliant analyst with an unblemished 20-year career suddenly found himself facing criminal charges. Judge Montgomery studied Michael intently. Mr. Chen, you're not just alleging corporate fraud anymore. You're describing a conspiracy that, if proven, could lead to one of the largest financial scandals in recent history. Michael met her gaze steadily. Yes, Your Honor, and I'm about to show you the evidence that proves it beyond any doubt. He reached into his backpack one final time, removing a small hard drive. This contains the complete output of my father's algorithm, running continuously since his arrest. Every transaction, every pattern, every connection, all authenticated and time-stamped. But more importantly, his eyes flickered to the increasingly agitated prosecution team. It also contains something that Goldman Exchange doesn't know exists. A complete backup of their internal communications database, automatically archived by my father's security protocols. And what those communications reveal will explain exactly why they were so desperate to silence him. A court technician connected Michael's hard drive to the display system, and for a moment, the courtroom held its breath. The screen flickered to life, displaying a database interface that seemed deceptively simple. Michael's fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced precision, navigating through layers of archived communications. What you're about to see, he began, his voice carrying a weight that belied his years, is a series of private messages between Goldman Exchange board members and certain regulatory officials. These conversations took place on what they believed was a secure, self-deleting platform. But my father's security system kept permanent records of everything. The first message appeared on screen, dated 3 months before Dr. Chen's arrest. It was from Marcus Goldman himself addressing a private group chat. Chen's new algorithm is becoming a problem. It's picking up patterns we can't afford to have documented. Legal team advises containment strategy needed ASAP. Winston surged to his feet. Your Honor, the defense cannot possibly verify the authenticity of these alleged messages. Michael smoothly interrupted. Actually, we can. Each message carries a unique digital signature and blockchain verification timestamp. But more importantly, he pulled up another window. These messages were automatically mirrored to multiple secure servers across different jurisdictions. Here are the authentication certificates from cybersecurity firms in Singapore, Switzerland, and Germany. Judge Montgomery examined the certificates while Michael continued. He displayed a sequence of messages that painted a damning picture. The board members had discovered that Dr. Chen's algorithm could detect not just ordinary market manipulation, but a sophisticated system of coordinated trading that had been operating for years. This message is particularly telling, Michael said, highlighting a conversation from 2 weeks before his father's arrest. Board member Thomas Richardson writing to the head of their regulatory compliance team, Chen's system doesn't just flag individual trades. It's identifying the entire network. If this goes public, everything we've built over the last decade collapses. The gallery erupted in murmurs as Michael displayed more messages. They revealed a carefully orchestrated plan to discredit Dr. Chen before he could expose their operation. But the most damning evidence was yet to come. "Now, watch this," Michael said, pulling up a new set of data. "These are trading records from the past 6 months after my father's arrest. The algorithm continued running, and it caught something fascinating." He displayed a series of transactions that formed a clear pattern. The same market manipulation continued, but with an interesting twist. The profits were being channeled through a complex network of shell companies, and when we traced the ownership of these companies, he projected a corporate ownership diagram that drew audible gasps from the gallery. The shell companies all led back to holding corporations owned by members of the regulatory board that had approved Goldman Exchange's trading practices. "Your Honor," Michael's voice cut through the commotion, "these regulators weren't just failing to enforce the rules, they were actively participating in the scheme. Every time my father's algorithm detected manipulation, their accounts showed corresponding profits. They were using their insider knowledge of the fraud to enrich themselves." Winston's team was now in complete disarray. The prosecutor himself sat stunned, staring at the evidence with a mixture of disbelief and resignation. But Michael wasn't finished. "And here's the final piece," he said, pulling up one last document. "This email was sent the night before my father's arrest. It's from Goldman Exchange's general counsel to the board. Chen's evidence has been contained. Regulatory cooperation confirmed. Recommend immediate action to prevent any data leaks." Michael paused, letting the implications sink in. Less than 12 hours later, FBI agents were at our door with a warrant based on fabricated evidence. Judge Montgomery leaned forward, her expression grave. "Mr. Chen, what you're presenting goes far beyond the scope of your father's defense. This suggests a level of criminal conspiracy that would warrant a federal investigation." Michael nodded solemnly. "Yes, Your Honor, and I've already provided copies of all this evidence to the Securities and Exchange Commission's Independent Oversight Committee and the Department of Justice's Financial Crimes Unit. They received the files this morning with instructions to open them if anything happened to prevent me from presenting this evidence in court." The prosecution table erupted in frantic whispers. Through the courtroom windows, people could see several dark SUVs pulling up outside the courthouse, federal agents responding to the evidence Michael had submitted. "Furthermore," Michael continued, his voice steady despite the growing chaos, "I've identified every trading account involved in this scheme. The total amount of fraudulent profits exceeds $2.1 billion, spread across 37 shell companies and offshore accounts. All of this data has been verified by independent forensic accountants, and their reports are included in the evidence package." Judge Montgomery surveyed the courtroom, taking in the shell-shocked prosecutors, the furiously scribbling journalists, and the poised teenager who had just exposed one of the largest financial conspiracies in recent history. "Mr. Chen," she said finally, "I believe we need to contact the U.S. Attorney's Office immediately. This case has clearly expanded far beyond its original scope." Michael nodded, then turned to face Winston and his team. "I believe, Mr. Winston, that this would be an appropriate time to discuss dropping all charges against my father. Unless, of course, you'd like me to continue with the evidence I haven't shown yet." Judge Montgomery's chambers had been hastily converted into an impromptu conference room. Representatives from the U.S. Attorney's Office sat around the massive oak table, their faces grave as they reviewed Michael's evidence. The teenager stood at the end of the table, his composure unwavering despite the intense scrutiny of a dozen seasoned legal professionals. "Mr. Chen," Judge Montgomery began, her tone measured but probing, "before we proceed with any further actions, this court needs to be absolutely certain about the validity of your evidence. You understand that the implications of your accusations could affect global financial markets?" Michael nodded, pulling out yet another carefully prepared folder. "Yes, Your Honor. That's why I've prepared this comprehensive validation report." He distributed copies around the table. "Every piece of evidence has been independently verified by multiple sources. The trading data has been confirmed by 3 separate forensic accounting firms. The digital communications have been authenticated by cybersecurity experts from MIT, Stanford, and the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Rodriguez leafed through the report, her expression shifting from skepticism to growing interest. These authentication certificates are impressive, but I'm more interested in how you managed to access this level of secured data in the first place. Even with your father's algorithm, these systems should have been virtually impenetrable. A slight smile crossed Michael's face as he opened his laptop. That's because Goldman Exchange's security team made a crucial mistake. They were so focused on preventing external breaches that they overlooked a fundamental vulnerability in their internal systems. He pulled up a technical diagram. My father's algorithm wasn't just analyzing trading patterns. It was also creating secure backups of every transaction it flagged as suspicious. When they tried to delete the evidence, they didn't realize copies had already been distributed to secure servers across multiple jurisdictions. Judge Montgomery leaned forward. And you were able to understand and navigate all of this sophisticated financial and technical data? At your age? There was a challenge in her voice, a final test of Michael's capabilities. Your Honor, Michael responded, standing to approach the room's whiteboard. Allow me to demonstrate. For the next 15 minutes, he delivered an impromptu lecture on advanced algorithmic trading patterns, cybersecurity protocols, and financial forensics that left even the most experienced professionals in the room taking notes. The key, he explained, drawing a complex diagram, was understanding how the manipulation scheme exploited microsecond differences in trading speeds across different exchanges. By correlating timestamp data from multiple sources, we can prove that certain trades could only have been executed with advanced knowledge of market movements. He turned to face the room. Knowledge that only came from their access to other investors' trading data, a clear violation of federal securities laws. One of the federal agents, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke up. Kid, I've been investigating financial crimes for 20 years and I've never seen anyone break down a complex fraud scheme this clearly. Where did you learn all this? Michael's professional demeanor softened slightly. My father. He never just taught me facts or formulas. He taught me how to think, how to see patterns where others saw chaos. Every weekend, we'd analyze market data together, turning it into a game. He'd show me how legitimate trading patterns looked different from manipulated ones, like finding constellations in a sky full of stars. Judge Montgomery exchanged glances with the U.S. attorney representatives. The teenager's combination of technical expertise and genuine passion was undeniable. But she had one final test. Mr. Chen, she said, pulling out a legal document. Explain to me how this evidence corresponds with the specific statutes violated under the Securities Exchange Act. She was testing not just his technical knowledge, but his legal understanding as well. Without hesitation, Michael launched into a detailed analysis, citing specific sections of securities law and relevant case precedents. He connected each piece of evidence to specific violations, building an airtight legal framework around his technical findings. Furthermore, he concluded, pulling up one final document, I've prepared a detailed brief analyzing how these violations intersect with RICO statutes, given the organized nature of the fraud and its connection to corrupt regulatory officials. He handed copies to the federal prosecutors. You'll find a complete timeline of predicate acts, establishing a clear pattern of racketeering activity over the past 5 years. The room fell silent as the professionals studied his brief. Judge Montgomery removed her glasses, fixing Michael with a penetrating stare. Mr. Chen, I've been on the bench for 20 years, and I've never seen anything quite like this. You've not only exposed a massive financial conspiracy, but presented it with a level of technical and legal sophistication that most experienced attorneys would struggle to match. Michael stood straight, meeting her gaze. Your Honor, when my father was arrested, I made a promise, not just to prove his innocence, but to expose the truth, no matter how deep it went. Every night for 6 months, while my classmates were sleeping, I was studying securities law, learning about financial forensics, understanding how to build an unshakable case. Because I knew that in this courtroom, against these opponents, anything less than perfection would fail. The U.S. Attorney representatives were now huddled together, discussing in urgent whispers. Judge Montgomery held up her hand for silence. Very well, Mr. Chen. You've convinced this court of your capabilities. The question now becomes, what do we do with this evidence? Michael reached into his backpack one final time. I believe this last piece of evidence will make that decision very clear, Your Honor. Because what Goldman Exchange doesn't know is that my father's algorithm caught something even bigger. Something that connects this fraud to international financial organizations and certain very powerful political figures. Back in the main courtroom, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Word had spread about the dramatic developments in the judges' chambers, and now every seat was filled. Journalists packed the gallery, their phones silenced but ready to break what promised to be a massive story. The prosecution table, once a picture of confidence, now sat subdued, with Winston looking years older than he had that morning. Michael stood before the bench, his final piece of evidence displayed on the courtroom screens. These transactions, he explained, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed room, show money flowing from Goldman Exchange's manipulated trades through a series of offshore accounts. But the final destinations are what make this truly significant. He highlighted several account numbers. These accounts belong to a private investment fund called Global Financial Initiatives, or GFI. Judge Montgomery, who had resumed her position on the bench with a new gravity to her presence, leaned forward. And the significance of this fund, Mr. Chen? GFI, Your Honor, serves as a private investment vehicle for 12 senior members of the World Financial Regulatory Commission, the same commission that recently blocked 3 separate investigations into Goldman Exchange's trading practices. Michael pulled up a new document. This is a memo from GFI's board meeting last quarter. Notice the discussion of guaranteed returns from their special trading arrangement with Goldman Exchange. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as Michael continued. Over the past 5 years, while Goldman Exchange was manipulating markets and corrupting regulators, GFI's members received over $500 million in investment returns. Returns that perfectly matched the profitability patterns identified by my father's algorithm. He turned to face Winston and his team directly. This is why they were so desperate to silence my father. His algorithm didn't just expose market manipulation, it exposed a global network of financial corruption reaching the highest levels of regulatory authority. At that moment, the courtroom doors opened, and several FBI agents entered, accompanied by senior officials from the Securities and Exchange Commission. They took positions around the room as Judge Montgomery addressed the court. In light of the extraordinary evidence presented today, and after consultation with federal authorities, this court is prepared to rule. She fixed Winston with a stern gaze. Mr. Winston, does the prosecution wish to make any statements before I proceed? The prosecutor stood slowly, his demeanor completely transformed. Your Honor, in light of the evidence presented, the state moves to dismiss all charges against Dr. James Chen. He paused, glancing at Michael. Furthermore, we request that all evidence collected today be transferred to the Federal Task Force for a comprehensive investigation into Goldman Exchange and its associates. Judge Montgomery nodded, then turned to Michael. Mr. Chen, your father's case is dismissed with prejudice. Moreover, she removed her glasses, her expression softening slightly. I want to commend you for what you've accomplished here today. You've demonstrated not just extraordinary legal and technical expertise, but remarkable courage in facing down powerful interests in pursuit of justice. Michael's professional composure cracked slightly as he turned to the gallery, where his mother sat with tears streaming down her face. The gravity of the moment, the vindication of his father, the exposure of the conspiracy, the triumph of truth over power, seemed to finally hit him. There's one more thing, Your Honor, he said, his voice catching slightly. I request that my father be released immediately. He's been held in federal custody for 6 months based on fabricated evidence, given what we've uncovered today. Already done, Judge Montgomery interrupted, allowing herself a small smile. Federal marshals are processing his release as we speak. He should be here within the hour. The gallery burst into applause, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. But the emotion in the room was palpable as Michael gathered his materials, his hands trembling slightly for the first time that day. The federal agents were already moving to secure evidence and detain key members of the Goldman Exchange team. Journalists rushed from the courtroom to file their stories, knowing they were reporting on what would become one of the biggest financial scandals in history. Judge Montgomery descended from the bench, approaching Michael as the courtroom began to clear. "Mr. Chen," she said quietly, "I've watched hundreds of attorneys argue in my courtroom over the years. None have shown the combination of brilliance, preparation, and moral courage that you demonstrated today." She paused, studying him thoughtfully. "Have you considered a future in law?" Michael smiled, thinking of all those late nights studying legal texts, of his father's patient teaching, of the journey that had brought him to this moment. "Actually, Your Honor, I have. But first," he looked toward the courtroom doors where a commotion was building. "I think my father just arrived." The doors opened and Dr. James Chen entered, still in his prison jumpsuit but surrounded by federal marshals who now treated him with obvious respect. When he saw Michael, he stopped, his eyes filling with tears. For a moment, father and son just stared at each other across the courtroom. Then Michael ran forward, all pretense of professional composure forgotten, and threw himself into his father's arms. "You did it, Doctor," Chen whispered, holding his son tight. "You actually did it." Michael pulled back, wiping his eyes. "We did it, Dad. Your algorithm, your teachings, everything you taught me made this possible." He gestured to the evidence still displayed on the courtroom screens. "They thought they could silence you, but they didn't count on one thing." "What's that?" his father asked. Michael smiled through his tears. "They didn't know you had a son who inherited your love for finding the truth in numbers." The following days unfolded like a whirlwind. The Chen family's modest apartment became the center of a media storm as news of the Goldman Exchange Scandal spread across the globe. Financial markets reeled as the full scope of the corruption came to light, and regulatory agencies worldwide launched investigations into their own oversight processes. Michael sat with his parents at their kitchen table, watching his father savor his first home-cooked meal in 6 months. The morning newspapers lay scattered across the table, their headlines screaming about the teenage legal prodigy and Wall Street's biggest scandal. But here, in the warmth of their home, none of that seemed to matter. "I still can't believe you taught yourself all of that," Dr. Chen said, looking at his son with pride. "The legal precedents, the financial regulations, the cryptography." He shook his head in amazement. "When did you sleep?" Michael's mother reached over to squeeze his hand. "He didn't," she said softly. "I would find him asleep at his desk every morning, law books for a pillow." Her eyes glistened. But he never complained, never gave up. A knock at the door interrupted their moment. Outside stood Judge Montgomery, along with Dean Harrison of Columbia Law School. The judge had traded her judicial robes for a simple business suit, but her presence still commanded respect. "Mr. Chen," she addressed Michael, "I hope we're not interrupting, but there's something we need to discuss." They settled in the living room where the dean opened his briefcase. "What you accomplished in that courtroom," Dean Harrison began, "wasn't just remarkable for your age. It was remarkable for any legal professional. The way you integrated complex financial evidence, technical analysis, and legal strategy." He pulled out an official-looking document. "We'd like to offer you a full scholarship to Columbia Law School, starting this fall." Michael's eyes widened. "But I haven't even finished high school yet." Judge Montgomery smiled. "We've spoken with your school administrators. Given your demonstrated expertise and the unprecedented nature of your courtroom performance, they've agreed to an accelerated graduation program. You've already proven you can handle legal work at a level far beyond most law school graduates." Dr. Chen sat forward. "This is incredible, but..." He looked at his son with concern. "Michael, you're only 16. You should have time to be young to..." "Dad," Michael interrupted gently, "do you remember what you always told me about talent? That it's not just a gift, it's a responsibility?" He turned to face the judge and dean. "I accept, but on one condition." "What's that?" Dean Harrison asked. "I want to start a program at the law school helping other young people learn about the legal system. Not just the rules and procedures, but how to use the law to fight for what's right. Michael's voice grew passionate. What happened to our family? I know we're not the only ones. There are others out there facing powerful interests, thinking they don't stand a chance. I want to help change that. Judge Montgomery nodded approvingly. Actually, that brings us to our second purpose for being here. The U.S. Attorney's Office is establishing a special task force to investigate financial fraud and regulatory corruption. They've requested your assistance as a special advisor, particularly in implementing your father's algorithm across other financial institutions. Michael looked at his father, who smiled encouragingly. They've also offered me a position, Dr. Chen added, to help develop new detection systems for market manipulation. It seems our father-son collaboration might continue in a new way. The conversation was interrupted by another knock. This time it was a team of reporters from major news networks requesting interviews. But before his mother could politely turn them away, Michael had an idea. Actually, he said, I would like to make a statement. He stood in the doorway of their apartment, facing the cameras with the same composure he'd shown in court. What happened in that courtroom wasn't just about proving one man's innocence. It was about showing that the truth can prevail even against the most powerful opponents. That justice isn't about how expensive your lawyer is or how many connections you have. It's about facts, evidence, and the courage to keep fighting when everyone tells you to give up. His words would be broadcast around the world, inspiring countless others. In the months that followed, applications to law schools nationwide would surge, particularly from young people from modest backgrounds. The Chen effect, as it came to be known, would spark a new generation's interest in using the law as a tool for justice. Back in their apartment, after the cameras had gone, Michael sat with his parents, Judge Montgomery and Dean Harrison, planning for the future. His mother brought out a family photo album, showing pictures of a young Michael sitting on his father's lap, learning about numbers and patterns that would one day help him change the world. You know, Dr. Chen said, looking at the old photos, when I created that algorithm, I thought I was just building a tool to detect fraud. I never imagined it would end up saving not just me, but potentially the integrity of the entire financial system. He looked at his son proudly, and I certainly never imagined that my teenage son would be the one to make it happen. Michael smiled, thinking about the journey ahead. Law school, the task force, the chance to help others fight their own battles for justice. Maybe that's what justice really is, he said thoughtfully. Not just knowing what's right, but having the skills and courage to make it happen. 1 month after the historic courtroom victory, Michael stood at the podium in Columbia Law School's largest lecture hall. The room was packed beyond capacity, with students and professors lining the walls to hear him speak. Behind him sat a distinguished panel, Judge Montgomery, his father, and representatives from the SEC and Department of Justice. The Goldman Exchange case wasn't just about market manipulation, Michael began, his voice carrying the same confidence that had captivated the courtroom. It was about the intersection of technology, law, and justice in the modern world. He clicked to his first slide, showing complex patterns of financial data. Traditional legal approaches are no longer enough. We need to combine technical expertise with legal understanding to fight sophisticated financial crimes. The audience watched intently as he broke down the methodology he'd used to expose the conspiracy. Law professors took notes as he explained how he'd integrated technical evidence with legal strategy. FBI agents in the back of the room paid particular attention to his explanation of tracking digital financial footprints. But perhaps the most important lesson, he continued, is that justice doesn't have an age requirement. It doesn't care about your credentials or your connections. It cares about truth, evidence, and the willingness to fight for what's right. He gestured to his father, who beamed with pride. My father taught me that numbers don't lie. When you combine that truth with legal expertise and moral courage, you become unstoppable. After the lecture, in a private meeting room, Michael sat with the panel to discuss the future. The SEC representative spread out a series of documents detailing a new initiative. We're calling it the Financial Integrity Protection System, she explained. It's based on your father's algorithm, but expanded to monitor markets globally. We want you both involved in its implementation." Dr. Chen examined the technical specifications while Michael reviewed the legal framework. "This could revolutionize financial oversight," Michael said, highlighting key sections. "But we need to ensure it remains independent from political pressure." The Goldman Exchange case showed how easily regulatory systems can be compromised. Judge Montgomery nodded approvingly. "That's why we're establishing an independent oversight committee. Michael, we'd like you to help design its structure, drawing from your experience exposing regulatory capture." She slid another document across the table. "And there's more. The American Bar Association is creating a new division focused on technological innovation in legal practice. They've requested your input on developing guidelines for using algorithmic evidence in court." Michael's mother, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "It's amazing how much has changed in just a month. But Michael, remember, you're still young. Don't let all this pressure overwhelm you." He smiled at her concern. "Actually, Mom, that's why I've been working on something else." He pulled out his laptop, showing them a website design. "I'm creating an online platform to connect young people interested in law and technology with mentors and resources. If I could teach myself these skills, imagine what others could do with proper guidance." The Dean of Columbia Law joined them, bringing news that would further expand Michael's impact. "The law school has approved your proposal for a new clinic focusing on financial justice. Students will work with you to help other families facing corporate fraud and corruption. We're already receiving inquiries from law schools nationwide about implementing similar programs." As they discussed the details, Dr. Chen's phone buzzed with news alerts. The Goldman Exchange investigation had triggered a wave of reforms across the financial industry. Other firms were voluntarily implementing stronger oversight measures, afraid of facing similar exposure. The Chen effect was reshaping Wall Street's approach to compliance and transparency. "You see," Michael said, pointing to the headlines, "this is bigger than one case or one family. We're creating a new model for fighting financial crime, one that combines technical innovation with legal expertise and moral purpose." He turned to Judge Montgomery. "That's why I'd like to propose something else. A summer program for high school students interested in law and technology. We could teach them the basics of legal analysis, coding, and financial forensics." The judge's eyes lit up. "Like a junior justice league, training the next generation of legal innovators?" She smiled. "I think you're onto something, Mr. Chen. In fact..." She made a quick phone call, then turned back to the group. "The Judicial Conference is interested. They've offered to help establish similar programs in jurisdictions across the country." As the meeting concluded, reporters waited outside for comments about the new initiatives. But Michael's attention was drawn to a group of high school students who had attended his lecture. They approached him nervously, clutching notebooks and legal texts. "Is it really possible?" one of them asked. "To make a difference like you did, even at our age?" Michael looked at his father, then back at the students. "Not only is it possible," he said, "it's necessary. The world needs people who aren't afraid to challenge powerful interests, who can combine different skills to fight for justice." He gestured for them to sit down. "Let me tell you how it all started, and how you can do it too." 6 months after the landmark case, Michael stood at the window of his new office at Columbia Law School, watching students cross the campus quad below. The space, though modest, held powerful reminders of his journey. Framed newspaper headlines about the Goldman Exchange Scandal, his father's original algorithm printouts, and most prominently, a photo of that first day in court when everyone had underestimated the teenager in the oversized blazer. The Chen effect had rippled far beyond that single courtroom, transforming the landscape of financial oversight. Goldman Exchange's collapse triggered a wave of reforms across Wall Street, with major institutions rushing to implement what became known as Chen compliance, the new gold standard in financial oversight. More importantly, Michael's story had inspired a movement of young people who refused to accept injustice, regardless of their age or circumstances. His computer chimed with a video call from Judge Montgomery, now heading the Judicial Committee on Technological Innovation in the courts. "The Senate just passed the Financial Justice Reform Act," she announced with a smile. "Your testimony made quite an impression." The legislation would revolutionize how financial crimes were prosecuted, ensuring that justice wouldn't be limited to those who could afford expensive legal teams. Dr. Chen appeared in the doorway, carrying takeout from their favorite Chinese restaurant, a tradition they'd maintained since those late-night study sessions. Michael's mother joined them, bringing acceptance letters for their summer program. Hundreds of high school students had applied, eager to learn how to combine law, technology, and justice to fight corruption. "Sometimes I still can't believe it," his mother said, looking around the office. "That morning when you walked into the courtroom, I was so scared for you." Michael smiled, remembering the mix of terror and determination he'd felt that day. "I just knew I had to try," he replied, gesturing to the photo on his wall. "Sometimes that's all it takes. The courage to take that first step." Narrator's voice enters, warm and engaging. What happened in that courtroom 6 months ago was more than just a legal victory. It was a testament to the power of unwavering determination and the courage to challenge a corrupt system. Michael Chen didn't just win a case. He sparked a revolution in how we fight financial fraud and inspired a generation to stand up against injustice. Today, while Michael teaches the next generation of legal minds at Columbia, his father's algorithm helps protect millions of investors worldwide. Their story reminds us that real change often comes from unexpected places, sometimes from a teenager who refused to accept that his father's voice would be silenced by powerful interests. Camera pans across Michael's office, focusing on letters from inspired young people. The impact continues to grow. Every week, more letters arrive from young people starting their own fights for justice. A 15-year-old in Ohio fighting corporate pollution. A 16-year-old in Texas challenging discriminatory school policies. A group of teenagers in Michigan uncovering local government corruption. Each one inspired by the lesson that age is no barrier to making a difference. This isn't just a story about a brilliant young mind who shocked a courtroom. It's about the power that lies within each of us, the power to stand up, speak out, and fight for what's right. It's about having the courage to take that first step, even when the odds seem impossible. Soft, inspiring music begins. If Michael's story has moved you, remember that you too have the power to make a difference. Maybe you're facing your own battle against injustice. Maybe you know someone who's struggling to be heard. Share this story with them. Let them know that with dedication, courage, and thorough preparation, one person can change the entire system. Final shot of Michael with his students. Remember his words. Justice isn't about how old you are, what degrees you have, or who you know. It's about having the courage to stand up, the dedication to prepare thoroughly, and the determination to see it through. If this story inspired you, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things to change the world. Leave a comment below about your own experiences standing up for what's right. Your story might be the inspiration someone else needs. This has been A Legal Mind Like No Other. Until next time, keep believing in the power of one person to change the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.